So as Christina said, we're going to talk about federal funding and uniform guidance updates that were issued in 2024. Just to go through this for anybody that gets federal funding, some changes there. I am an audit manager in the Chambersburg office. I did graduate from Shippensburg University, and I have 28 years experience. Joined SEK in 1996. I manage about 25 plus audits each year, and I also manage compilations, reviews, and 990s for over 40 plus smaller nonprofit clients throughout the year. So the nonprofit space consumes a significant amount of my time during the year. And I spend a lot of time in this area. So the topics we're going to go over today is the background of the changes, the objectives of the changes, some of the key provisions, effective dates, and then how does that impact the recipients of federal funding? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go over the background first. And the background, the Uniform Guidance provides a framework for management of federal funds issued by the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB. And in 2013, the OMB issued a uniform guidance to basically streamline a lot of the federal rewards under one document so that everybody was following the same rules, playing by under the same game, I guess, if you will. It does apply to all recipients of the federal awards. And when they came out in 2013, the intention was to update the uniform guidance every 5 years. And they've been sticking to that. They did a smaller update in 2020, but the most significant revision yet was issued in 2024, which is what we're going to go over today. So the objectives of the changes. The biggest objective was to incorporate statutory requirements and administrative priorities. As you can imagine, there are multiple federal agencies. So the uniform guidance was designed to basically pull together some of those administrative priorities and make sure the statutory requirements were consistent across all the federal agencies. The second objective was to reduce the agency and recipient burdens. You'll see they did raise some thresholds that should make some of the information required from the agencies and the recipients a little less burdensome because some of the thresholds have increased. It will take some of the requirements away from the recipients. Clarifying sections of the prior guidance that were interpreted in different ways. They realized that between some sections there were some disparities in how people were interpreting them. The organizations may interpret it one way, the agencies may interpret another way. So they tried to clarify the wording with this to make them a little more concise so everybody's on the same page. Then you rewrite the applicable sections in a plain language, improving flow and addressing inconsistent use of terms. Again, trying to make the language as clear as possible so that everybody is working off the same documents and understanding the same way. And there is another polling question. Get that out of the way. So some of the key provisions, there was several terminology changes within this update, and I've just highlighted a few of them here. Grants and agreements is now federal financial assistance. So grants and agreements you will not see within the uniform guidance anymore. Non-federal entity is now recipient or subrecipient in subparts A through E. However, the subpart F retained a non-federal entity to align with the Single Audit Act. So you will see recipient and subrecipient in just subpart A and through A through E, but subpart F will retain that non-federal entity. You or your is now gone. You is replaced with recipient throughout the documents. Small purchases is now called simplified acquisitions. And micro purchases and simplified acquisitions are now types of informal procurement methods for small purchases. So again, a lot of clarification of the wording just throughout the documents, just to make things a little more concise, a little more uniform. Two more key provisions to clarify some of the guidance. There was some type of graphical errors that were corrected, and there was also cleaned up some other wording. Again, there were some inconsistencies between some of the sections. And they just cleaned a lot of that documentation up so that they're more concise and they align with each other a little better. And again, emphasize the use of plain language to make it more accessible to all organizations, from the smaller organizations to the largest organizations. If you get any kind of federal funding, you are technically under the uniform guidance. So it just makes it a little more accessible and easily readable by all organizations, no matter what your size. Another key provision was previously you were required to report all violations of federal crime involving fraud, bribery, or gratuity violations. Now you must promptly disclose when there is credible evidence, and you'll see credible evidence is bolded there, of a violation of federal criminal law involving fraud, conflict of interest, bribery, or gratuity violations under the False Claims Act. So they clarified that and made it a little more, give it a little more meat, if you will, to have the credible evidence and then needs to be reported under the False Claims Act. So that's a little more in depth and a little more clear than what it was in the past. It was much more broad. They also had a requirement to take reasonable cybersecurity and other measures to safeguard information, including personally identifiable information, any other types of information that's deemed sensitive. That's pretty broad. They did not really get into a lot of details on that, but you are required to have reasonable cybersecurity measures over that sensitive information. A few more provisions that permits the Indian tribes to be treated the same as states and follow their own procurement policies and procedures, which was not in place before. Recipients or subrecipients may exercise judgment in determining the number of bids obtained as adequate. So that does give you some judgment there of how many bids you think you need. Just do as many bids as you feel is adequate to get a fair representation of the pricing of the costs of those projects, and that is considered adequate then. And pass-through entities must accept all federally negotiated indirect costs for subrecipients now. So in the past, there was certain prior written approval requirements under the cost principles, but they have been removed for certain sections. Now, the cost principles still stay in place. You still have to follow the cost principles, but it no longer requires prior written approval requirements for these particular areas. It's real property, equipment, direct costs, entertainment costs, memberships, participant supporting costs, selling and marketing costs, and taxes. And again, this isn't just a blanket way we don't have to follow the cost principles. You still have to follow the cost principles, but you don't have to get certain written prior approval requirements for some of these pieces now. Another part of the provisions that allows cognizant agencies for audit or oversight agencies to authorize an extension if the 9-month filing requirement would place an undue burden. Previously, only the OMB could grant that extension. Now the oversight agencies can grant that extension for the 9-month filing requirement if there is an undue burden. The CFA may now be prepared in accordance with GAAP or OCBOA, so it can be prepared in accordance with GAAP, or if you're on modified cash basis, it can be reported in that manner also. And on the CFA, when you have question costs and you indicate that they are not determinable or unknown, you must report why the dollar amount was undetermined or could not be reported. You can't just indicate the question cost cannot be determined. You have to indicate why. Why were you not able to determine what that amount was? Why is that amount why is that amount unknown? Why were you not able to get to that? You just have to indicate and disclose on there why you weren't able to disclose that information. It does revise the definition of the period performance to mean the time period between the start and end of a federal award, which may include one or more budget periods. There was some confusion about that in the past, but this clarifies that that period of performance is from the start to the end of the federal award period. It doesn't really play into the budgets. You could have multiple budget periods, but it goes by the federal award beginning and end dates. The period of performance also does not commit to the federal agency to fund beyond the current approved budget period. So they clarified that. And the federal awarding reports may not be required more frequently than quarterly. Some of the federal agencies were coming up with their own monthly reporting requirements. And this clarifies that they can only do it quarterly as the most frequent you can report on federal award fundings. This is probably the most important slide and the one that everybody is talking the most about. The first bullet point is the biggest one. The single audit threshold was increased from $750,000 to $1 million. So in the past, if you had federal expenditures over $750,000, you were required to have a single audit. That is now $1 million. So if your federal expenditures are under $1 million, you will not need to have a single audit. There is no single audit requirement anymore. So that's going to take, it's going to take a certain percentage of the potential audit requirements out. But when you consider all the dollars, it's a very small percentage of the total fiscal dollars spent under the federal government. But it does reduce, again, some of that burden for some of the smaller organizations that will not have to have single audits anymore. De minimis rate for indirect costs has increased from 10% to up to 15%. You'll see the up to is underlined there. Before it was just a straight 10%. Now it can be any percentage up to 15%. You're gonna have to work with the agency on that to determine, what rate is acceptable within those parameters. But you can go up to the 15% now. The limit on fixed amount subawards has been increased from 250,000 to 500,000. They increased the capitalization threshold for equipment and supplies from 5,000 to 10,000. However, you still need to use the lower of your capitalization policy or 10,000. So if your capitalization policy is 5,000, you still need to use your capitalization policy. But this change does allow you to, increase that capitalization policy to 10,000. That is the threshold now that you can use and change your capitalization policy to that. Does increase the definitional threshold for modified total direct costs from 25,000 to up to 50,000 for each subaward. And in line with the first bullet point, it increased the type A threshold to $1 million for awards expended from 1 million to 34 million to kind of align those. Next. So the effective dates, these changes were effective October 1st, 2024. And there is some confusion, especially for the audit. The audit threshold and the type A program threshold will be reflective for years ending on or after September 30th, 2025. So if you're June 30, 2025, these changes will not be effective for your audit this year. It will impact September 30, 2025. It will impact December 30th, 2025, and June 30, 2026. These changes for the audit will be impacted related to that. The new federal awards issued on or after October 1st, 2024 are assumed to follow the updated guidance. Conversely, then, the awards issued prior to October 2024 should use the previous uniform guidance. The sub-award should follow the same version as the primary award. And any exception was granted to allow recipients and subrecipients to use the revised $10,000 equipment thresholds, the capitalization thresholds we talked about, even if the awards were under the previous guidance. But this needs to be permitted by the federal agency that made the award. But you can go back and change your policy and use the $10,000 thresholds even for awards under prior guidance. That was one exception that was granted. Next. So what do recipients need to do? So this, it affects anybody that receives federal funding. So you need to understand the changes and how it will impact your organization. Many sections require the recipient to have written or documented policies and procedures. That's always been a requirement. That's nothing new. However, with the changes, some of the changes that are in here, you're going to need to go back and look at your policies and procedures, review your internal controls, and make sure those policies and procedures align with some of the changes within the guidance that was issued. Need to understand the effective dates and what this will mean for your organization. As we went through the effective dates, depending on when your awards were done. You may be under the previous guidance, you may be under the updated guidance. You just have to verify that and make sure you're working under the right guidance. You need to educate your staff on the revisions and impacts of the organization. And you need to indicate the applicability of the revisions by award on the CFA. This is going to be a critical one in your CFA. You're going to have to indicate, when you list your award, does this award fall under the previous guidance or under the updated guidance? That's going to have to be an indication on the CFA so that the oversight agencies can see which set of guidance that particular award falls under.